In this presentation, I want to give you a basic orientation to two signs that are used fairly frequently in Laon to notate isolated notes: the punctum and the uncinus. Laon uses the punctum for isolated notes much more frequently than does Sangal. Its rhythmic value must simply be expressed as the normal rhythmic value of the syllable it denotes in the context of the overall text. For example, let's take a look at the introit Puer est for the third Mass of the Nativity of the Lord. In the second line, the word cuius is notated in Sangal with a tractulus and a virga, simply indicating that the first syllable is sung on a lower pitch than the second syllable. Laon uses two puncti. It does not give a sign of pitch differentiation, just the indication that these syllables are sung in a normal pattern of speech rhythm. The uncinus is also used frequently for isolated notes. There is not an exact corollary between the uncinus and a particular sign in the Sangal system. Sometimes where an uncinus is used in Laon, a tractulus will appear in Sangal. At other times where an uncinus is used in Laon, a virga will appear in Sangal. For example, let's take a look at the introit Hodie dies, sung for the Mass of the Vigil of the Nativity of the Lord. We see in the first word, hodie, that Sangal uses a tractulus for the first note, denoting that it is lower than the following notes, and also indicating that it is to be given a slight amount of emphasis. Otherwise, the scribe would have notated it with an apostrophe, as he does here in the introit Dominus dixit ad me, for the Mass of Midnight for the Nativity of the Lord. Back to the chant Hodie dies. While Sangal uses a tractulus for the first note, Laon uses an uncinus. In this particular context, the uncinus of Laon might be interpreted similarly to the tractulus in the Sangal notation, that is, it gives a slight emphasis to the beginning note. Otherwise, the scribe might have used a punctum. That is not to say that every punctum in Laon is intrinsically shorter than every uncinus. This rhythmic interpretation is contextual. The second two syllables of hodie are notated in the Sangal notation with tractuli. Laon uses uncini. The first syllable of the word sciatis is notated in the Sangal notation with a virga, denoting a higher pitch level for this new word. Laon uses an uncinus. The second syllable of the word has first a virga with an episema in the Sangal notation. Laon uses an uncinus with a T to indicate tenete, that same lengthening that the episema indicates in the Sangal notation. The final syllable of this word is a clivis, lengthened by an episema in the Sangal notation. Laon uses two uncini. The use in Laon of two uncini rather than a clivis can also be interpreted as an indication to lengthen the syllable, as would be normal in such a cadence. One characteristic of the uncinus is worth noting here, and that is that there are different sizes of uncini, notably 3. It seems that different sizes of the uncinus are used at times to represent relatively, and that is important, relatively different syllabic values. Both Cardin and Augustoni talk about the different types of uncini indicating average or normal syllabic time, decreased syllabic time, and increased syllabic time. The average size uncinus has an average-sized stem and tail. The uncinus of decreased syllabic time has a short tail. And the uncinus of increased syllabic time has a noticeably larger tail. Sometimes the stem may be shortened a bit. For example, if we look again at the introit odiecietis, we see that the first uncinus is larger, that is, the tail is more exaggerated, than are the next two. This gives further credence to the interpretation that the first note is somewhat lengthened. However, Agustoni and Cardin might say that it is more average, and that the next two have decreased syllabic time. That is, they are slightly less than average. In either case, the first is slightly longer than the next two. If we look at the second line, the syllable nus, N-U-S, which ends the word dominus, is notated in Laon with 4 uncini. The last two have an A for augete, to lengthen between them. Notice that the third uncinus has a slightly longer tail than do the others. This is the same with the 3 uncini over the syllable bit, B-I-T, at the end of the word salvabit. In this second case, there is also an A in the midst of this grouping, again indicating a lengthening. Now the question rises, is this uncinus with a slightly longer tail longer in duration than the others? Perhaps, but not in any sense that is rhythmically definable in the way we define, that is, the way we measure rhythm today. Rather, these notes are the high notes of the neumes, and the slightly longer tail on their respective uncini simply reminds the singer to give whatever emphasis, agogic accent, would be normal in the context. I should note that the rhythmic lengthening of various uncini can be indicated more clearly with letters such as the T that we saw over the uncinus that began the second syllable of scietis in the first line. The difference between the sizes of the uncini can be subtle and not always easy to detect, especially between the second and third, or the average size and the increased syllabic time size. For example, in the communion Omnes qui in Christo, sung on the feast of the baptism of the Lord, we can see in the second line for the word estis, there are several uncini. If we look at the 3 uncini that descend from the top of the melodic incise, we see that the first clearly indicates a lengthening or increased time in the Cardin-Agustoni terminology. The second could be the shortest type, and the third could be the average uncinus. The third uncinus precedes a quilisma, which gives a certain amount of emphasis to it, that is, to the uncinus. So that would justify an interpretation that gives it a certain amount of emphasis or length. One could argue that using separate uncini in this context rather than 3 puncti gives the whole figure some added weight. And while the size differentiation of the first uncinus is fairly obvious, perhaps there are variations in the sizes of the following 2, and perhaps these variations add some nuance to the figure, but in truth, not anything that is not also indicated by the context. So in the aggregate, these size variations cannot be interpreted in some kind of exact mathematical manner. Like all semiological interpretation, they must be understood in a larger context of textual, melodic, and modal analysis. In this light, Augustoni makes two recommendations. First, begin with an attentive study of the text and its relationship to the modal melody, in order to quickly clarify the overall context of the piece. It is a mistake to study the signs immediately, as if they represent a set of absolute rhythms. And second, do not consider the signs only under the aspect of the duration of the sounds. Sometimes they may indicate a kind of emphasis or importance that is not expressed simply by a perceivable lengthening of the syllable or note. He summarizes, the study of the neumes demands first of all an analysis of the function of every graphic sign and every neume element. This analysis is based primarily on the text and on the melodic and modal facts.